On a Tuesday in late October in a town called Hearst in northern Ontario, a 53-year-old woman sat at her kitchen table and counted what she had left. $211. She counted it once, stacked it, and counted it again, not because she doubted herself, but because her hands had nowhere else to go while her mind refused to accept that this was the sum of 31 years. Her name was Mabel Ashworth. She had been a wife for those 31 years, and a widow for 11 days. Outside, the birches along the fence line had already dropped most of their leaves. The sky over the Canadian Shield was the color of old pewter, flat and low, and the cold that pressed against the kitchen window was the kind that didn't apologize. She had grown up in this cold. She had raised a marriage in it. She had buried her husband, Roy, in it, in the small cemetery past the grain elevator, where his family had 3 generations of headstones already waiting for company. Roy Ashworth had been a handyman, not the kind who advertised in the weekly paper, not the kind with a van and a logo and a rate card, the kind who simply showed up when something broke and stayed until it was fixed. He drove a rusted Ford pickup the color of dried mustard, and he had driven it for 22 years because, he said, a truck that still ran was a truck that didn't need replacing. He charged what people could pay. When they couldn't pay, he came back the next week and fixed something else instead, as if that first job had been a favor, and this one was a different matter entirely. Mabel had been a bookkeeper. She understood ledgers. She understood that a dollar going out was a dollar not coming in. And she had spent 31 years watching her husband operate, as though that equation did not apply to him. She had loved him before she understood this about him, and by the time she understood it fully, she had already built a life around the deficit. She was not a bitter woman. She had never been bitter. But she had been tired, and tired over the years had its own weight. On the kitchen table beside her $211 sat a white envelope from Larkin and Associates, the law office in Kapuskasing. Roy had used them once, years ago, for something she couldn't remember. The envelope had arrived 3 days after the funeral, addressed to her in Roy's handwriting, not the lawyer's. Her name in Roy's careful block letters, the kind of printing a man uses when he wants to be sure he's read correctly. She had not opened it yet. She was not sure she was ready for whatever he had thought to give her. Roy Ashworth had left his wife everything he owned: the house, the half-acre of yard, the shed out back with its wall of tools arranged with a precision that had never once carried over into their finances, and a property on the edge of town that Mabel had not thought about in years. A building on Tamarack Road, the old Duchesne Hardware, shuttered since 2009, when Gerald Duchesne's knees gave out and his son moved to Calgary and no one came to buy the place. Roy had bought it in 2011 for back taxes. He paid $900 at a county auction while Mabel was at her sister's in Timmins, and didn't find out until he mentioned it over supper. 2 weeks later, the way another man might mention he'd picked up milk, she had not spoken to him for 4 days after that. $900. For a building with a failed roof, no current electrical, and a reputation in town as the place teenagers went to throw rocks through the windows on Saturday nights. She had called it his folly ever since. His folly on Tamarack Road. 14 years of a joke she had repeated so many times it had stopped being funny and become just a fact like the weather. Now it was hers. She set the envelope down and looked at it for a long time. Then she put on her coat and drove to Kapuskasing. The lawyer's name was Helen Park, a woman about 60 with silver hair cut close and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She shook Mabel's hand and poured her tea without asking, and sat across the desk with the expression of someone who had delivered complicated news before and knew there was no shortcut through it. The will was straightforward. Roy Ashworth had left everything to his wife: the house, the tools, the truck, the building on Tamarack Road. Helen Park went through each item patiently, and Mabel nodded at each one, and then Helen reached into the file folder and set a second document on the desk. It was notarized. The heading read, Covenant of Community Use and Preservation, Tamarack Road Property, Hearst, Ontario, registered with the Cochrane District Land Registry, March 3, 2016. Mabel looked at it. She did not touch it. Roy came in and had this drawn up about 8 years ago, Helen said. He was very specific about what he wanted. I'll explain what it means, but I want you to read it first. Mabel read it. She read it twice. The language was legal and careful, and most of it required Helen's translation, but there was one clause near the bottom she understood without any help. A clause that said the Tamarack Road property had been formally registered as a community repair and resource depot, with a covenant binding it permanently to that purpose. No commercial development, no sale to a private entity, no change of use without unanimous consent of a registered community trust that Roy had apparently set up quietly and named without telling his wife. Mabel set the paper down. "He told me not to tell you," Helen said, not unkindly. "He said he didn't want you carrying it." Mabel drove home in the dried mustard truck and sat in the driveway for a while. She was not crying. She was doing something harder than crying, which was trying to rearrange 14 years of a joke. She had called it his folly. She went inside and made tea she didn't drink and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the birches until the light went. Then she took her coat and her boots and her flashlight, and she drove to Tamarack Road. She had not been inside the old Duchesne hardware since Gerald closed it. She remembered it as a dim and well-worn place that smelled of rope and linseed oil, and the particular dustiness of a store that has sold things to the same families for 40 years. The sign above the door was still there, the paint faded to almost nothing, the D and the H still faintly legible if you knew to look. Roy had a key on the same ring as the house key. She found it on the third try. The inside was not what she expected. She expected ruin. She had been expecting ruin on Tamarack Road for 14 years. What she found instead was a building that had been tended. The roof, the failed roof that had been one of her primary objections, had been patched and repatched in sections. A careful, ongoing repair rather than a proper job. The kind of repair a man does when he has more time than money but takes the time seriously. The front windows, the ones the teenagers had broken, were covered in plywood she could see had been replaced at least twice. The floor was swept. The shelves along the east wall. Gerald Duchesne's old stock shelves, solid pine, the kind you don't make anymore, were not empty. She walked toward them with the flashlight. They held tools, dozens of them, some old, some newer, all of them clean and labeled with strips of masking tape in Roy's block printing, pipe wrench 18-inch, tile saw, works, drywall screws, assorted, extension cords. Check the middle one. There were power tools on a lower shelf, each one tagged with a yellow sticker that said free two-row. Sign the book. There was a clipboard hanging on a nail beside the shelf with a handwritten log, names and dates and what they'd borrowed, and underneath each entry, a line for when it was returned. Mabel took the clipboard down. She read it in the beam of the flashlight. The first entry was dated September 2012. A name she recognized, Ed Tremblay, who lived 3 streets over and whose house she had driven past 1,000 times. Circular saw, 1 week, returned. Below it, 6 months later, pipe snake, borrowed for the Hendersons, returned next day. And further down the page in a different pen in Roy's writing, Patricia Sauvé, extension ladder, 2 weeks. Roof was worse than she thought. Left the ladder until spring. The log ran for 12 years. Mabel counted the pages. There were 11 of them, front and back, every line filled. She sat down on the floor of the old Duchesne hardware with the clipboard in her lap and read. She read entries for people she knew and people she had never heard of. She read about a family from the reserve north of town who had borrowed a generator for 3 weeks one winter when the power went out and didn't come back. She read about a single mother on Crawford Street who had borrowed the tile saw in 2017 and apparently used it to retile her entire bathroom over a long weekend. She read about an old man named Bertrand who borrowed a level every spring to check the foundation posts on his house and always brought it back with a bag of butter tarts for whoever he found at the building, which, in 12 years of entries, was always Roy. She read an entry that stopped her. November 2019. The Kozlowski boy, 16, came in asking if we had a space heater. Furnace gone. Family not talking to the landlord. Left him our spare from the truck. Asked him to bring it back when they got sorted. He did February with a card his mother made. She turned the page. There were entries she had to read slowly, because Roy's handwriting went careful and close in those spots, as if the thing he was recording deserved more room than usual. A woman who had come in and sat for 2 hours in the warmth of the building one January because she had nowhere else to go. Roy had written, made her tea on the camp stove, did not ask questions. She borrowed a caulking gun, said she'd be back. She was in March. Fixed her own window. I showed her how. A man who had come in 3 times over one summer before Roy understood he was not looking for tools at all. Carl again today, 3rd time this month. Pretended to need sandpaper. Sat for an hour. I think he is very alone. Invited him to help me sort the fastener bins. He stayed most of the afternoon, good worker. Comes in Wednesdays now. There was an entry so brief it took her 2 readings to understand it. October 2020. A boy left a note under the door. It said, You fixed my bike once when I was 8. I still ride it. I don't know if you remember me. I wanted you to know I remember you." Roy had kept the note. It was folded and tucked under the clip of the clipboard, the paper soft with handling, as if he had taken it out and read it more than once. Mabel held the note for a long time in the beam of the flashlight. She had thought she was going to cry in this building. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something she didn't have a word for right away. A slow, irreversible settling, like a foundation that had been slightly tilted for a long time and had finally found level. She had spent 14 years thinking Roy poured himself into a money pit on Tamarack Road. She had spent 14 years calculating what that $900 could have become if he'd put it in an RRSP. She had spent 31 years of marriage doing the accounting and coming up short and handing him the numbers, and watching him look at them with honest attention, and then say something about the Kozlowski boy, or the woman in January, or the man who came in on Wednesdays. And she had never once understood what he was building here. She drove home after midnight. She did not sleep. Before we tell you what she found the next morning, and it is the thing that changes everything about what Roy Ashworth built in that building, we want to pause for 1 second. If this story is speaking to you, if you believe the kind of life Roy lived deserves to be told, please hit subscribe and leave us a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. One comment is enough to help this story reach the person who needs to hear it today. Now, let's go back to Mabel, standing in the Duchesne building just after sunrise. She had come back because she couldn't stay away. She had brought coffee in a thermos and her own flashlight with fresh batteries and her reading glasses. And she started at the back of the building, where a narrow door she had assumed was a storage closet turned out to be a second room she hadn't found the night before. Inside was a workbench. On the workbench were the tools of whatever Roy had been doing in here beyond lending things out: a disassembled toaster, 3 bicycle wheels in various states of repair, a child's wagon with a new axle half-fitted. On the shelf above the bench were binders, the same kind of dark green binder Roy had used for everything. Tax records, receipts, the manual for the truck. She opened the first one. It was not tax records, it was a record of repairs. Every repair Roy had done in this building for other people, organized by year. Each entry had a name, a description of the item, what was wrong with it, what he did, how long it took, and whether the person had paid anything. The cost column, for the most part, was blank. Sometimes it said coffee. Once it said a dozen eggs and great conversation. Once it just said no charge. She cried when it worked. Mabel opened the second binder, the third. There were 9 of them, running from 2012 to 2023. The last entries made 8 weeks before Roy died. The last entry in the last binder, in October, in handwriting that was slightly slower than his usual. She recognized it as the handwriting of a man whose hands had started to hurt in the cold, read. Sadie Morin brought in her mother's sewing machine. A 1974 singer, said it hadn't run in 20 years. Took the whole afternoon. Runs beautifully now. She wept. Said her mother used to make her Halloween costumes on it. I told her it just needed someone to believe it was worth fixing. She laughed. Good laugh. Mabel closed the binder. She sat at the workbench for a long time. Then she went home and called her sister in Timmins and told her about the binders. And her sister listened without saying anything for quite a while, and then said, Mabel, did you know any of this? And Mabel said no. She had not known any of it. She had been 3 streets away for 12 years while her husband ran a community repair depot out of a building she called his Folly, and she had not known. She went back every day that week. On the 3rd day, a car pulled up outside and a woman got out. About 40, work coat, careful eyes, the look of someone who wasn't sure she'd come to the right place. She stood at the door until Mabel opened it, and then she said her name was Joelle, and she'd heard through someone that the building might be opening again, and she wanted to return something. She held out a hand drill. Old but clean, the chuck wiped free of rust, a small paper tag tied to the handle that said Roy's, Tamarack Road. My husband borrowed it in 2018, Joelle said. Roy told him to bring it back whenever. My husband passed away last year. I found it in the garage 2 weeks ago. I didn't feel right keeping it. She paused. Roy fixed our furnace in 2019, she said. We couldn't pay him. He said not to worry about it, he said. She stopped, and her voice did something small and careful. He said, you'll pay it forward when you can. That's how this works. Mabel took the drill. She thanked Joelle. She asked if she wanted tea, and Joelle said yes, and they sat on 2 folding chairs in the Duchesne building and drank tea from Mabel's thermos and didn't talk much, and it was the most comfortable Mabel had felt in 11 days. After Joelle left, Mabel stood at the shelf and looked at the binders. She had spent 31 years thinking Roy did not understand money. She understood now that he understood it exactly, and had simply decided, with full knowledge of the mathematics, that there were things worth more than what money could hold. He had not been a man who failed to grasp the equation. He had been a man who had looked at the equation and quietly added a column she had never seen. More people came that week. Not many, but steadily, the way news travels in a town that size, through the hardware store and the Tim Hortons and the side conversations in the parking lot of the Canadian Tire. A man who had borrowed the pipe snake came to return it properly, now that there was someone to return it to. A woman who hadn't known Roy, but had heard about the building from a neighbor, came to ask if someone could look at her mother's wheelchair. The footrest had sheared off and the medical supply place wanted $400 for the part. Mabel looked at it and realized she didn't know how to fix it herself, but she knew where Roy kept the metal adhesive and the clamps, and she spent an afternoon watching YouTube videos and trying until it held. It held. She wrote it in the binder. She didn't think about why she wrote it in the binder. Her hands just did it, the way her hands had always known what to do when she stopped arguing with them. On the Sunday of that week, she drove to the Tim Hortons and sat in a corner booth and looked out the window and let herself think about the money. The $211. The roof of the house that needed a section of shingles before December. The oil bill coming in January. Roy's truck insurance, which she had 3 months to figure out what to do with. She was 53, and her bookkeeping clients were mostly local small businesses, and 2 of them had been slow to pay before Roy died, and would be slower now because people gave grace to grief, and she would need the money more than she needed the grace. And somewhere in those numbers, a building on Tamarack Road that cost nothing to keep if she kept it simply, that held 12 years of records of the people Roy had quietly served, that was covered by a covenant she didn't fully understand yet, but that a lawyer in Kapuskasing had told her was, in legal terms, permanently bound to its current purpose. A purpose that was, when she looked at the binders, essentially this: fixing what other people could not afford to fix, lending what other people could not afford to own, and recording every name so none of them would be forgotten. She thought about that covenant. The date on it was March 2016, 8 years ago. She tried to remember what had been happening in March 2016 and couldn't specifically, but she knew that around that time there had been talk in town of a developer from Sudbury looking at the Tamarack Road corridor for a strip mall project. She remembered Roy coming home late one night that spring and being quiet over supper, quieter than usual. She had thought he was tired. Now she understood he had been to see Helen Park. He had seen it coming. Not this developer, maybe not this year, but something. Someone who would look at a building on a revitalizing street and see only square footage, and he had made sure, 8 years before anyone came with money, that the building could not be what someone with money wanted it to be. He had not told her. She understood now why he had not told her. If he had told her, it would have become her burden to carry the reason, to worry about whether it was enough, to lie awake doing the calculations. He didn't want her to carry that. He wanted the law to carry it. She sat in the Tim Hortons and understood that the man she had shared a bed with for 31 years had been quietly building her a shelter she hadn't known she was standing in. Now I'm going to tell you what happened next. The part where everything Roy prepared was put to the test. But before I do, if you're still with us, please hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps stories like this reach the people who need them. Now, back to Mabel. The letter arrived in November, 2 weeks after Mabel had begun spending her afternoons at the Tamarack building. It came on municipal stationery, from the office of a company called Norlake Development Group, with a Sudbury address. The letter was polite. It acknowledged her recent bereavement. It noted that the property at 14 Tamarack Road, Hearst, had been identified as part of a potential redevelopment corridor. It offered her $112,000 for the property. Mabel sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. $112,000. She thought about the $211. She thought about the oil bill. She thought about being 53 with no pension and a bookkeeping practice that depended entirely on relationships that Roy's funeral had, in some ways, refreshed, and in others, made complicated. She thought about what $112,000 would mean. A winter without fear, a roof without patches, A year, maybe 2, of breathing room. She thought about the wheelchair footrest she had glued back together last week and the entry she had written in the binder. She put the letter in her coat pocket and drove to the building. She sat at Roy's workbench and read the letter again, in the light from the high windows Roy had once, apparently, cleaned. She looked around at the shelves with their labeled tools, at the clipboard with 12 years of names, at the binders with 12 years of repairs. She thought about Joelle with the hand drill and her late husband and the furnace. She thought about Carl, who came in on Wednesdays because he was very alone, and sorting fastener bins gave him something to be alongside. She thought about the boy who had left the note under the door. "You fixed my bike once, when I was 8. I still ride it." And she thought about something Roy had said to her once, years ago, that she hadn't understood at the time. They'd been arguing about the building, one of the dozens of small, slow arguments that accumulated over the years around Tamarack Road, and she had said, with genuine exhaustion rather than cruelty, "Roy, what is it for? What do you think you're actually doing over there?" And he had looked at her in that way he had, the way that was never defensive and never quite answered the question directly, and he had said, "I'm trying to make sure that when something breaks, someone shows up." She had written it off at the time as the kind of thing a person says when they don't want to have an argument. Now she sat at his workbench in November and understood that it was the whole of his philosophy stated plainly, and she had missed it because it was too simple to seem like enough. She drove to Helen Park's office the next morning. Helen had the covenant document already out, as if she had been expecting this visit. She explained it again, more slowly this time, because Mabel had questions she hadn't known to ask the first time. The property at 14 Tamarack Road had been placed under a permanent community use covenant in March 2016, registered with the District Land Office, and simultaneously enrolled in a recognized community trust. A small, quiet, not famous kind of trust used in Northern Ontario for exactly this kind of arrangement. Under the terms of the covenant, the property could not be sold to a private developer. It could not be converted to commercial use. It could not be demolished or substantially altered without the unanimous consent of the trust, which consisted. Mabel read this part with wide eyes, of 5 people in Hearst, whose names she recognized: the woman from the library board, the pastor of the United Church, Ed Tremblay, whose entry was the first in the tool log. 2 others she knew by sight from town events. Roy had built a committee. He had built a legal structure. He had done it quietly 8 years ago, and had apparently not mentioned it to any of the 5 people he enrolled, beyond a single conversation about what they were agreeing to, and a handshake that Helen described with a small professional smile as unusually binding for a handshake. He knew the development pressure would come eventually. Helen said, "He told me that the building wasn't worth much on paper, but that location was going to matter to someone someday. He wanted to make sure that when it did, the community already owned it. Not Mabel Ashworth, the community." Mabel looked at the covenant. She thought about the fact that Roy had paid $900 for this building in 2011, spent 12 years fixing other people's things inside it, had it legally protected in 2016, and had never, in any of that time, mentioned the covenant to his wife. She said, "He didn't want me to feel obligated." Helen nodded. "That's what he told me. He said, if Mabel knows about the covenant, she'll feel like she has to fight for it. I don't want her to have to fight. I want it to be already won." Mabel sat with that for a moment. 31 years beside a man, and she had fundamentally mismeasured him. She had thought he didn't plan. He had been planning in ways she hadn't known to look for. She had thought he didn't protect her. He had been protecting her, quietly, with law instead of words. For nearly a decade, she had thought the building was the thing he chose over their financial security. It turned out, the building was a form of financial security, not for her bank account, but for something harder to repossess. She drove back to Tamarack Road. The Norlake letter was still in her coat pocket. She set it on the workbench beside the last binder. She looked at both of them in the November light. There was not really a decision to make, she realized. There had been a decision made 8 years ago. Carefully, legally, with a notary and a handshake and a committee of 5 people who had borrowed tools and eaten butter tarts in this building, and had apparently agreed without quite knowing it to become the custodians of what Roy was building here. She was not the one standing between this building and the developers. Roy had made sure she would never have to be. She wrote a letter back to Norlake Development Group. She kept it brief. She thanked them for their interest and informed them that the property at 14 Tamarack Road was subject to a permanent community use covenant, registered with the Cochrane District Land Registry in 2016, and was held in trust by the Hearst Community Resource Trust, and was therefore not available for private development at any price. She attached a copy of the covenant. She signed it. She drove to the post office and mailed it herself, standing in line behind a woman mailing a birthday parcel, which seemed exactly right. The Norlake representative called her 3 weeks later. He was polite, as developers tend to be right up until they are not. He asked about flexibility. He asked about creative arrangements. He asked whether the trust's composition might be open to revisiting. She told him she would convey his interest to the trust and thanked him for calling. The trust met in Helen Park's office that December. Mabel had asked Helen to convene them, and the 5 members of the Hearst Community Resource Trust, some of whom had apparently not spoken to each other since Roy enrolled them, sat around a table and read the covenant together and then voted unanimously to uphold it. The Norlake representative did not call again after Christmas. The building stayed. Spring came late to Hearst that year, as it usually does in the north, but when it came honestly. The snow pulling back from the roads in stages, the birches along Mabel's fence line going thin and green, the light lasting later each evening until there was enough of it to work by without the overhead bulbs. Mabel and a retired electrician named Pete Marchetti, who had been one of Roy's Wednesday regulars, spent 2 Saturdays in March rewiring the front section of the building so the outlets actually worked reliably. Pete took no money. He took coffee and the satisfaction of a job done right in a place Roy had built, which Mabel was beginning to understand was its own form of currency in this community. People kept coming, not many at once but steadily. Joelle came back, this time not to return something, but to ask if she could volunteer on Thursday afternoons, because she was a retired dental hygienist with careful hands and nothing particular to do with them. A young man from the Cree Nation north of town came with a broken snowblower and stayed to help fix 3 other things while he was there, and then started coming on his own on alternating Saturdays. A woman named Sylvia who ran the food bank, 2 streets over, started sending people Mabel's way, when what they needed was a working appliance rather than groceries. Mabel kept writing in the binders. It felt at first like maintenance, like keeping Roy's records for him the way she had kept his accounts, a continuation of a job she already knew. But somewhere in that winter she understood it was something else. She was not maintaining his record. She was making her own. Each entry she wrote was a person she had sat with, a thing she had learned to fix or had helped someone else fix, a name in the log that had not been there before she arrived. She was not Roy. She was a bookkeeper, not a repairman, and there were limits to what she could do alone. In a building full of tools, she was still learning. But she had spent 31 years making other people's numbers work, which meant she understood systems. And what this building needed was a system, a schedule, a sign-up sheet, a way to know who was coming and what they were bringing, and who might be able to help. She made those things. She put them on the wall by the door in a frame she found in the back room, and the building began to run the way a building runs, when someone who understands order is paying attention to it. The man named Carl, the one who came in on Wednesdays, because he was very alone, kept coming on Wednesdays. He had been a machinist for 30 years before his plant closed, and once Mabel understood this, she stopped trying to find things to keep him busy and started asking him to teach her. He taught her to measure twice. He taught her what a caliper was for, and when you needed one, and when you were overthinking it. He had a way of explaining things that suggested he had been a teacher once in some other life, and had simply been waiting to be asked. One afternoon in April, Mabel found a box she had missed in the back of the storage room. It was sealed with packing tape and labeled in Roy's block printing for Mabel. When she's ready, she sat down on the floor with it. Inside were letters, not in envelopes, not addressed anywhere, just folded sheets of paper, dozens of them, each one with a name at the top. She picked up the first one. The name at the top was Bertrand, the old man who borrowed the level every spring and brought butter tarts. Roy had written Bertrand a letter. It was 3 paragraphs. It thanked him for the company. It said the building would have been a lonelier place without a man who checked his own foundation posts every spring rather than waiting for something to go wrong. It said Bertrand had taught him that maintenance was a form of faith. Mabel opened another letter. It was for the woman named Patricia who had borrowed the extension ladder and whose roof was worse than she'd thought. She opened another. It was for Carl. Roy had written a letter to every person in the Wednesday circle and to a dozen others besides. He had never sent them. He had written them the way some men pray, privately, without expectation of response, because the writing was the point, not the receiving. At the bottom of the box was a single letter with her name on it. She held it for a long time before she opened it. It was not long. Roy had never been a man of many words, and the letter was true to him in that way. He said he knew she had never understood the building. He said he was sorry he hadn't been better at explaining it. He said that the explaining wasn't really something he knew how to do, that the building was easier than the explanation. He said he hoped that when she finally went inside, properly inside, not just to tell him it was foolishness, she would find what he had been trying to build. He did not describe what that was, because he believed she would know it when she saw it. He said he had hidden the covenant not to keep her out of it, but to keep her free of the obligation of defending it. He said she was the strongest person he had known for 31 years, and he had no doubt she could have defended it. But he did not think it was fair to ask her to spend whatever years she had left in a fight he could win for her before he was gone. He said he was sorry about the $900. He said he wasn't sorry about the building. He said, "You always knew the worth of a stitch, Mabel. I was just trying to find out the worth of a door left open. I think we were doing the same thing all along." She folded the letter and held it, and did not try to stop herself crying, because some things are not worth stopping. She cried not just from grief and not just from love, but from the particular ache of understanding something true about it. You no longer have the chance to tell them you understand. It is the loneliest kind of knowledge. It is also, she came to realize, a kind of gift, because it means there was more to know than you thought, which means the life was larger than it seemed, which means you were married to more person than you realized, and that is not nothing. That is very nearly everything. She delivered the letters herself that spring. She drove to Bertrand's house and sat at his kitchen table and gave him his letter and watched him read it, and the old man's hands shook on the paper. But his voice was steady when he said that Roy Ashworth had been the best man he knew. She left a letter in the Wednesday box for Carl, who read it alone, and then came to the building the next Wednesday and sorted the fastener bins without saying a word about it, which was exactly the right response. She mailed the letter to Patricia in Thunder Bay, where she had moved 2 years ago. She found Joelle's letter and gave it to her on a Thursday afternoon, and Joelle read it standing at the workbench, and then set it down and picked up a pair of pliers and went back to what she was doing, which was also the right response. The one she kept for last was the boy with the bike. She didn't know his name. Roy's entry hadn't given it, and the note under the door had no signature. She folded that letter, put it in an envelope, and pinned it to the board by the door of the building with a note that said, "If you once left a letter about a bike, this is for you. Ask Mabel." No one claimed it that spring. It stayed on the board through summer and into fall. Mabel stopped expecting it would be claimed and started thinking of it as part of the building, the way the clipboard was part of the building. A thing that hung in place, because some things need to be present even when they're not yet received. Then, on a September afternoon, a young man came in. He was maybe 25, work boots, the look of someone who had driven a while to get somewhere he wasn't sure he'd find. He stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves and the binders and the board with the flyers and the single envelope pinned to it. And then he looked at Mabel. "Is there a letter here?" he said. "For someone who left a note about a bike?" Mabel gave him the envelope. He read it standing there. He read it twice the way she had learned to read Roy's things, once for the words and once for the space between them. When he finished, he looked up and his eyes were wet and he said, "I didn't know if he got my note. I didn't know if it mattered." Mabel said, "He kept it under the clipboard for 11 years. He took it out sometimes." The young man nodded. He stood in the building for a while. Then he asked if there was anything he could do to help, and Mabel said yes, there was always something, and she showed him where the sign-up sheet was. He started coming on Saturdays. By the second winter, the building on Tamarack Road had more volunteers than Roy had ever had. Pete Marchetti on the electrical side, Carl on precision work and measuring, Joelle with her careful hands, the young man from the Cree Nation whose name was Thomas, and who turned out to have a gift for small engines that he said he'd taught himself from YouTube videos and necessity. The young man with the bike, whose name was Adam, and who could not fix anything mechanically, but who had spent 2 years running a community social media account and offered quietly to start one for the building. Mabel said yes. She did not tell them Roy's full story all at once. She let it come out the way Roy had let things come out. In pieces, at the right moment, because the right moment was when it would mean something to the person hearing it. One evening in February, when the building was warm from the space heaters and 6 people were working at various stations, and the snow was coming sideways outside, and no one particularly wanted to leave, Mabel opened the first binder and set it on the workbench and said, "This is where we came from. You should know." They read it in turns, passed it around the table. Each of them found something in it, a name they recognized, an entry that made them laugh, an entry that made them quiet. Carl found his own entry and read it 3 times without saying anything. Joelle found her husband's entry about the furnace in 2019 and put the binder down for a minute before picking it up again. When they were done, Thomas said, "Who keeps the record now?" Mabel put her hand on the newest binder, the one she had started when she came back from the lawyer's office in November a year ago, the one that was now more than half full of her own handwriting. "I do," she said. "And now you do too." The building an appraiser would value only by square footage became, over those years, something the town measured differently. By the number of people who had a reason to show up, a name in the log, a thing they had learned to fix or had taught someone else to fix. The tools went out and came back. The binders filled, the sign-up sheet got longer. On a Tuesday in November, exactly 2 years after Mabel had sat at her kitchen table and counted $211, she sat at Roy's workbench in the Dushin building and opened a fresh binder and wrote the date at the top of the first page and her name at the top of the log and under it. In columns Roy would have recognized the names of the people who had come that day and what they had needed and whether it had been fixed. It had, mostly. And for the things that hadn't, she wrote down who was coming next week to try. She had not become rich. She had not solved the oil bill in any permanent way, and the roof of the house still had a section that worried her in the heavy springs. But she had understood something that year that no column of numbers could hold. That Roy Ashworth had spent 31 years building the one thing that can't be appraised and can't be repossessed and can't be converted for development. He had built a reason for people to show up for each other. He had built a door that stayed open, and the measure of a door is not what it's worth, it's who comes through it. She wrote the last name of the day in the log, and closed the binder and turned off the lights and locked the building, and walked to the truck in the cold dark, the kind of cold that doesn't apologize. She drove home on roads she had driven for 30 years. She turned into her driveway. The birches along the fence line were bare again, silver gray in the headlights, and the kitchen window was lit from inside where she had left the lamp on. She looked at the light for a moment before she went in. It was the same window she had stood at for 31 years. It looked the same. But she was not the woman who had stood there counting crossings like coins slipping through her fingers. She was the woman who had finally read the ledger. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the yellow light, not counting anything, just sitting in what Roy had left her. Not the building, not the covenant, not the truck or the tools or the 12 years of names. The understanding. The one that arrived, as it so often does, just after the door had closed behind the person who held it all along.